Oh, you stay right there then, because I'm gonna introduce you. So I've had the great fortune in the last 18 months of visiting several countries and a variety of cities around the world, and it's been trying to carry the message of how important this next infrastructure is to everyone, and working around in the smart city conferences, et cetera. And it's great to travel around and do that, but what's even greater is when you can meet someone, connect, and really figure out how to work together. And that happened to me in Kansas City, where we were at the same event, National Science Foundation, et cetera, event, and I got a wonderful treat in hearing Dr. Norton talk about urban mobility. And he had a compelling message on how, if you will, unintended consequences can happen when you're thinking about infrastructure or designing infrastructure. And it hit me like a ton of bricks of why certain things happen in cities. It's not about sometimes, whether it's some sort of motive or anything. It's just a prism that some people look through. And I'm so happy that after that time frame we met, I think back in March or whatever it was, Dr. Norton, and here we are today having him here in Harlem, New York City, bringing his message and his magic to us. So I won't go on any further. I'll simply introduce the man who took the train for Virginia to go here. He doesn't like social media. He doesn't carry a cell phone, but he's smart and capable. I try to track him down, and it's like you got to get the FBI involved. So with that, Dr. Norton, come on up and do your thing.
Thank you, Mr. Banks, for that very generous introduction. It's a great honor to be here. I'm also extremely intimidated. The speakers today have been amazing. I need your help. What's the name of the assemblyman from the Bronx? That gentleman, I heard more facts from him in 15 minutes than I've heard from the President of the United States in his whole life. And I was just in awe, and I'm thinking, how can anybody manage to speak after him? But he was, he had peers follow him too, who were also extraordinary. So, and I'm also, to be honest, rather intimidated to be here specifically because I've been welcomed in this sacred space, and I consider it sacred space. And I'm aware of the fact that I don't know what the answer would be if I could go back and ask my predecessors if they would have been as welcoming to everybody in this room as you all have been welcoming to me. So I recognize that. I came 300 miles, but it feels like 3,000 or 30,000 because I took the train from Charlottesville, Virginia, where my children, first they started out going to school literally in the shadow of an equestrian Robert E. Lee. When the morning sun caught it just right, the shadow actually cast its shade over the school. Of course, they went on to another school, so in that case, the shadow came from Stonewall Jackson instead. And so for me to wake up yesterday morning in that town and then to sneak out at the middle of the day during the break and take a walk on Martin Luther King Boulevard and then reach the corner of Malcolm X Boulevard and then walk up to Frederick Douglass Boulevard was rejuvenating and liberating because those messages of freedom are for all of us, and I feel liberated by them as much as anyone. Let me get underway here. I call this talk Data Don't Drive, and the reason is I keep hearing that it does drive. I hear that all these solutions are so-called data-driven solutions. I don't want to be misunderstood. Data is essential. Data is absolutely indispensable. We need it. We need more of it. I also just think that data is the most dangerous thing we have. And I also think that data truly don't drive, which I think means we have a job to do, which is figure out what does. Because before we know what really drives, we are the dupes of those who would use data to manipulate us or you or anyone else. We need to be part of those solutions rather than to be presented so-called data-driven solutions as if there's nothing that you can say to those solutions because, after all, they are data-driven. When I spoke in Kansas City and had the great honor, surprise, and privilege of meeting Clayton Banks, I spent a large part of that talk at the beginning trying to connect the talk specifically to the exact spot where we were, what was there before the convention center was there that we were talking in. And since Clayton seems to have liked that presentation, I thought I'd try to connect it to this talk to Harlem a little more. Harlem, a place I studied and was fascinated by, but never really knew or experienced and don't claim to know. But I can try to make the connection anyway through my historical lens. What I knew, the little I knew about Harlem, and I'd read a lot about it, was mostly from Harlem in its golden age and the decades that followed. I wanted some help connecting it up to the present. And ironically, the source of help that I found most useful was a historian. But maybe not that ironic, because I don't think anyone really understands the present until they understand the past that gave birth to that present. So I found a wonderful historian, a man I'd never heard of before, but I bet some of you have heard of this man. His name is Michael Henry Adams. And there he is, being arrested because he was protesting the demolition of the Renaissance Casino in 2014, and the police are stopping them there. He was repeatedly shouting, and this was the purported grounds for the arrest, was his noise. He was repeatedly shouting, "Save Harlem now." And I think this is the first syllable of Harlem that this camera captured his mouth at. He's trying to draw attention to the loss of Harlem as a place, not as a location, that will endure, but as a real distinctive cultural place. And specifically, I think it's easy to take Mr. Adams' position as a statement specifically about historical monuments, like buildings. But I read his article in the New York Times, and they are, of course, these buildings, as important as they are symptomatic of the culture that underlies them. And when you lose the buildings, you're losing something of the culture that gave rise to them. I mean, no one's going to be demolishing the Parthenon in Athens anytime soon, because that culture is alive and well. But what about the culture right here? So I recommend this article, May 2016 article on the end of Black Harlem. I learned a lot from it. I realize that there's people who disagree with it, and I'd like to hear from them as well. But in this article, he points out the ironies of the fact that we have Frederick Douglass's statue outside this extremely expensive condominium that's new right in front of him. These are pictures from that article. He notes the loss of these cultural monuments of Harlem. Many of these losses quite recent, like the Lenox Lounge, and like Small's Paradise, which is now the site of an IHOP. That's a completely different building. These are the sorts of losses he's talking about. I took a quick stroll on 125th today, and across the street from the Apollo Theater, of course, is Mart 125, which has great local significance next to Gap, and I think this captures the kind of transition that he's talking about. And of course, this has a lot to do with urban mobility. I hope to make that connection a little clearer as we go along. So I can't give you this article, but I can give you two sentences, the two sentences that struck me the most and that have stayed with me. Here they are. And I want to concentrate in particular on a couple of words in here. He uses the word neighborhood. And a lot of the so-called experts that I talk to or listen to, the word neighborhood's not part of their vocabulary. I hear terms like urban area or location. I don't hear neighborhood. Blank slate. I put a block around that because I think a lot of the unintended consequences that Clayton referred to earlier came from the mistake of looking at places as if they are mere locations with no history, which is the heritage word, and with a future that has nothing to do with the people who made that history. No, there's no continuity, there's no organic growth. And it's, as Clayton said, not usually because of an actual hostility to these things, but an incapacity to connect with them, which is another reason why I like this statement, because he recognizes that these people, quote, have no idea how insulting they're being. There's a kind of naive innocence about it, you might say. How do I translate this message? It connected with me quite powerfully because it reminded me of a message I'd seen as a child at the end of a 1939 movie that probably most of you have seen called The Wizard of Oz. There's no place like home. And I ask you to consider if our data is yet capable of making the distinction between a residential location and a home, or between a area a residential area, and a community. I've heard the word community today with reassuring frequency. It's not a word I hear as much as I'd like to hear. This is the blank slate view that I see far too much of. I work in an engineering school, though I'm a historian, and this is, Michael Henry Adams referred to the blank slate mentality. This is the blank slate mentality made quite visual. This is the notion of a mobility future where there appears to be nowhere that people are coming from, nowhere they're going to. There's no place where you've arrived. And in fact, this landscape is a fantasized blank slate for the engineers to create their designs on, completely independently of the communities, the neighborhoods, the people who live in them. A blank slate that is history-less. And I'm not saying ahistorical, I mean history-less, story-less, devoid of stories, and spatially blank, temporally blank too. I've stressed maybe a little too much the spatial blankness. There's a temporal blankness too. In other words, there's no history, there's no future. It's sort of in a steady state. You can see this going way back. This is an RCA transistor ad for the driverless car future. This is already being envisioned decades ago. But look at that cityscape. I mean, that could be any city through which these automated vehicles are going. And as you can see, there's little room for anybody else. This is the blank slate mentality. And I think the blank slate mentality is a very dangerous one, and one that's fundamentally hostile to the notion of technology serving people, serving neighbors, serving neighborhoods, serving communities, instead of people, in effect, becoming components in a technology they don't understand and can't control. Here's where I took a lesson from a medical doctor. His name is Abraham Verghese. He was born in Ethiopia, but he lives at Palo Alto, California, where he's a professor of medicine at Stanford. And I think he was able to diagnose, to use a medical metaphor, the ailments of the US medical sector with an extraordinary freshness, and one that I think we can learn from as well, engineers, experts, technologists, and community members. He wrote a novel called Cutting for Stone, and it's based on a line in the original oath, the Hippocratic oath that medical doctors take. And in that, the ancient version of the oath, the doctor promises not to cut for stone. This is a mysterious expression, and Verghese looked into it to see what it meant. And it meant that there had been, in Hippocrates' time in ancient Greece, a notion that, or a practice whereby people would promise to give you an extraordinary cure, but they would have to cut out alleged stones in your body, like gallstones or something like this. Now, in ancient Greece, this practice was usually fatal, but you got paid before the patient died, before the operation, so the doctors made a lot of money. And to Verghese, this was a nice little metaphor for modern medicine, where you make a lot of money off of a lot of people's misery. And I think that's actually highly analogous to what we do with our cities, with urban mobility, and with other kinds of technology. Again, not that the technology is itself wrong, but rather the technology applied without a notion to the particular patient involved. I'm going to give you one little line from that novel. Wasn't that the definition of home? Not where you are from, but where you are wanted. This is a notion of home as essentially incorporating the notion of belonging. And too often, far too often, our communities have been treated as if the people who live in them don't actually even belong in them. So that's Verghese's message for medicine. You can see that diagnosis in the experts. Sergey Grimm was a mid-20th century US expert on urban planning, or so people treated him at least. And we live in the world that that kind of expertise helped to build. I want to give you just some symptomatic expressions. So you see he's talking about tomorrow's urban areas, right? That means today's urban areas, because he was writing in 1958. And notice that he uses the word urban area. I've been at Silicon Harlem all day, and I haven't heard anybody refer to Harlem as an urban area. I haven't heard anybody refer to their community as an urban area. Urban area is the blank slate mentality. This is the wish to turn it into a scientific specimen by cleaning up the messy components, and the messy components just happen to be human beings. Old cities, there's a suggestion that these are obsolete, right? Notice how he uses the word city only in the context of an obsolete place. The ideal is this pristine blank slate. They are growing obsolete. What we need is to rebuild them. You know, I think too well all the story of the rebuilding of American cities around this notion for high speed. Why do you want high speed? Well, because this is for people who don't live there. If you already are where you need to be, you don't need high speed. Safe and rapid movement of people is what it's after. Wide rights of ways, big urban highways, off-street parking. This is the stuff we need in urban areas. Urban areas, I find, in my experience, to be highly correlated, highly symptomatic of it's the occupants of buildings or the occupants of communities as if they are merely the incidental elements rather than the essential subject matter. So what for medicine, Verghese says in medicine, instead of just going straight to the test results, we should connect with the patient first. This is how medicine always was. We thought we got past that. We thought we got better than that, so we stopped connecting with the human being and started connecting only with the data results. So I want to connect this to urban mobility more specifically. I want to talk about driverless cars. And when I talk about driverless cars, or when I look into them, what I seem to find is a sort of an ironic result, which is it turns out that driverless cars are always sold as if they are data-driven, which indicates to me that actually they're not driverless, they have data driving them, which means we ought to be asking ourselves, what drives the data? What drives the data? What drives the data? I urge us all to keep asking, what's driving the data? Who selects the data? How are the data interpreted? Whose agendas are those data serving? And what agendas are not on the table in those situations? So instead, I'm going to talk briefly now about driverless data because I think we have to begin with driverless data. Check out some of the public relations that are coming out of the sectors, the tech sectors and the automaker sectors that are producing these things. They are data-driven. Notice that these depictions of the data-driven future are predominantly connected with the products that are being sold, while the people these products are supposed to be serving are often hard to see. Right? Look at these presentations. Data-driven mobility is a phrase you will see over and over again in presentation after presentation. Thank you. In presentation after presentation, data-driven mobility, data-driven futures, everything is data-driven. And I wonder, well, maybe actually communities, the people in them ought to be driving some of these things. Data-driven is so ubiquitous, it was very easy in a couple of minutes to find a dozen books with data-driven in the title. There's something about this expression that's magic, at least to the people who use it. And I think it is that once you say your solution is data-driven, it's very hard for me or for you to say, well, now hang on, I don't like it, right? Because they can say, well, that's tough, it is data-driven. I think we ought to be able to question that much more than I've been seeing happening. Consider the compass. The compass is a data instrument. It gives you data on the direction that you're going, right? It doesn't give you a lot of data, but you can read a compass frequently, and it still won't tell you where you should go. No matter how much data you collect from your compass, it won't tell you what port of call, what destination you should steer your ship to. You can get a high-tech version of this, like this expensive GPS version. Still, all it will do is tell you where you are going. The compass and the GPS do not determine where the ship sails. The ship is sailed by a combination of power, like wind in the case of a sailing ship, and on also the authority of the officers or the captain of the ship who decide where to go. So if data is analogous to the compass, if data is analogous to the GPS device, they don't drive the ship, they don't drive anything. It is entirely in the decision of the people who are in control of the ship and the motive power of the ship, whether it's wind or some other form. So with that in mind, I want to connect this back to Verghese and his medical diagnosis. He published an article in the New York Times a few years ago, Treat the Patient, Not the CT Scan. It's a great title. I think you can take a lot from that title. I want to zoom in on two sentences in it. First one's here. The computer record creates what I call an eye patient. In other words, it's not the full human being. What is an eye patient according to Verghese? The eye patient is that fraction of the patient that is captured in the data that the tests report. And that is never, according to Verghese, a satisfactory basis on which to treat a complicated human being. A second line I want to quote in here. The ease of ordering a scan has caused doctors' most basic skills in examining the body to atrophy. He says, begin with the patient, begin by connecting with the patient, not as a data source, but as a human being with a past, a human being with stories, a human being with experiences. And I want to now consider what would that be like to apply that wisdom, not to one individual human patient, but to a place where people live. We could start at a very elementary level, like, for example, with this map of a place. This is approximately Harlem. I put the National Black Theater in the center of this map. It doesn't tell us very much. It might tell us actually a little bit. For example, Marcus Garvey Park tells us a little bit about the values of this community. It appears to be a community that values what Marcus Garvey had to teach. You could find more in this. We could change it to a satellite view. We can get more data out of this as well. I would say this is still at a very superficial level. We've only just begun. Check, for example, that there is no temporal dimension to this. In other words, no time dimension. We can add that in. This is a 1925 photographic composite view, approximately of the area with Marcus Garvey Park there, and where we are is just east of that in the center. It's still, though, only the most rudimentary beginning, but you can see that at least physically there's been a lot of continuity in this neighborhood. This is actually 4 different maps that I fused together. They're fire insurance maps, so they actually have a lot of information. We are right here at 2132 Fifth Avenue, just north of 125th Street. You can see that in this world of 100 years ago, we were across the street from a synagogue at that time. Up here was what was then called a boarding school for colored children. And this gives you a sense of where this community was about a century ago. We can see actually the corner where the National Black Theater is today, thanks to the Museum of the City of New York. You can see that bicycling in the 1890s was quite big. Right now, we're at the far right of that photograph where that white building with the arched windows is. This is a corner of 125th and 5th. And you can see there's a hotel here. It's called the Triborough Hotel. Like every place, it's rich in stories. With the help of newspaper databases, I learned that in 1938, a 27-year-old failed salesman wrote a tearful note to his mother and then committed suicide in it, for example. In other words, every place is rich in stories if you just probe into them a little bit. Here's the corner of 125th Street, looking toward Fifth Avenue. I think some of you recognize the closest building, which is still standing. The building next to it is now a vacant area with foliage and trees, and it is called the Frederica Lila Tier Square, after one of the founders of the National Black Theater. Here we have another view of 125th Street showing you the YMCA. And this is the boarding school for colored children that I mentioned, which is very nearby. Right across the street from us was Temple Israel, formerly the Holy Trinity Episcopal Church. You can see in its changing function the transitioning neighborhood of a century ago. On 1 East 125th Street, where the former body shop is, very close to here, there were dresses sold. All of these things are trivial, in a sense, but this is what Verghese is recommending. Get to know your patient. Get to know them. Get to know their stories. There was a place right here, check this out, 2031 Fifth Avenue, that's right here, was in 1942 the site of something called the Harlem Ashram. It was a Hindu site established by 2 white guys from the Midwest who were huge admirers of Gandhi. They went to India to back Gandhi, to back independence, to back nonviolence, and to back Hinduism. They got expelled by the British, so they said, well, let's go to Harlem and stir up some trouble there. And they organized a march, which they called a pilgrimage to Washington, of just 14 people, so a very small march, and they took out this march. Right here at 1 East 125th Street, which is just a 1-minute walk from here, right here at the corner, there was another extraordinary thing. These are just things I found trying to get acquainted with this place, this spot. which was called the Moorish Islamic Center. And we can find out a lot about the Moorish Islamic Center and its temple number 41, which was right in this corner. The information is quite abundant because of the fact that the FBI had it under surveillance. And these are the FBI reports on Temple 41. They had these reports going in 1943, and that's no coincidence because Temple 41 was preaching pacifism and anti-colonialism, and that was all the FBI needed to suspect them of being in cahoots with the Japanese. And so these reports here, which as you can see from these boxed text segments, are about this spot practically where we're on right now, like a 10-second walk south of us, or about these places, right? If you want to find out more about the patient, you have to go beyond the geography and listen. And who better to listen to than James W. Johnson, writing in the New York Age, one of the great African-American newspapers of the early 20th century, where he says, every nationality is making money off of Negroes in Harlem except Negroes. The few Negroes who are doing business only emphasize this statement. Is there any good reason? Is there any good excuse for this? Well, I think this is maybe one of the backstories behind why we're here now. We're talking about trying to make a community where instead of merely being consumers of other people's technology, this community can become the creators of that technology that other people can consume. Well, this is an old dilemma. It's an old dilemma in all colonized places, and I think it's fair to say that Harlem, like most other communities of color, was to some degree colonized. And this is good evidence of that. The same newspaper, the New York Age, actually in 1916 did a study of who owned the businesses that Harlemites shopped at. Blue means they were white-owned. Black means they were black-owned. And you can see that except on 135th Street, most of these businesses were white-owned. And the New York Age is saying, wow, this is, they didn't use the word colonialism, but they came quite close to that. One of the people who read this, presumably this article, was well known to all of us, Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey had something to say about this phenomenon, and I got it from this book called Black Nationalism in American Politics and Thought. Now, when I was an undergraduate history major, I learned that nationalism was a bad thing. Why? Because nationalism is essentially the close first cousin of fascism, and it has a very grim history in Europe. But it took me until graduate school to start to figure out that nationalism also has a very positive sense, and that is in its anti-colonial sense. And Marcus Garvey was an anti-colonial nationalist, and he had the following thing to say on October the 26th. Did you catch that date? On October the 26th, 1924, according to this book, he said, it's time for the Negro to stop allowing himself to be bamboozled and tricked and fooled by Tom, Dick, and Harry. All right? October the 26th, let's remember that because that means it is exactly 94 years ago today that he had this to say. And bamboozling is a nice word, I think, for what a lot of tech public relations does when it says our stuff is data-driven, therefore, shut up and take it, all right? Stop allowing himself to be bamboozled, right? This is a message that I think you can see responded to more in action than in words in Harlem in the sense of the famous Harlem numbers game, also called the policy game. This was like a lottery conducted by Harlemites themselves. It was illegal, but most of the police were on the take. It was very profitable, so it attracted the Italian mafia in. And one of the leaders of this, she was called the Policy Queen, Stephanie St. Clair, was in effect, I think, acting out the wisdom of Marcus Garvey's message and making sure that the money that Harlemites spent went back into Harlem. Now, I don't think actually it was, the most progressive way to redistribute wealth. It mostly went from people who couldn't spare the nickels and dimes they were risking to people who would then sort of accumulate it like Stephanie St. Clair did. But this is a world better than having that money leave the community. And it's very interesting to me that the state of New York treated this as entirely illegal until it decided actually to take it over. And in 1967, the state of New York introduced the third state lottery in U.S. history. Here's one of the early lottery tickets. And suddenly it was no longer a numbers racket. It was the lottery, and everybody should play. This is, I think, a sort of nice little microcosm of these kind of phenomena. I want to give us a little closer look at Harlem. A lot of this was more for me than for you, for me to get better acquainted. This shows you what you still have, which is very lively busy sidewalks where there's a lot of people, a lot of things going on. Already by the time this postcard came out in 1946, though, the transportation experts were pretty much seeing only the vehicles. The people were invisible to them. In other words, think about it. The data were the vehicles. The pedestrians did appear in their data mostly as obstacles to vehicular flow by this time. Check out Harlem's sidewalks, like this 1939 photo by Sid Grossman. The sidewalks are very busy places. They're busy places of commerce. They're places of social life. They're places of community. And they're also children's playgrounds, as you can see in this case. They are places of business, as they remain today. This woman is selling beech nut gum on a sidewalk. So a sidewalk has an economic importance that's very easy to miss. I'm shifting to Baltimore just to illustrate that this man, from the point of view of the traffic experts of his time, was an impediment to traffic flow. But he's also part of the economy, and the local economy probably depends much more on his trade than on the trade of the commuters from suburbia driving around him. This is 1974. Federal Highway Administration is characterizing pedestrians as a source of delay to vehicles. That's what a pedestrian is to transportation experts. And that's why you see sidewalks. I owe a big debt of thanks to an architect named John Massengale, who found this photograph and matched it. This is Fifth Avenue, this is Midtown, but you can see the sidewalk is vanishing. And a vanishing sidewalk is a symptom of a kind of selective data collection that says that sidewalks aren't worth much. We want vehicles. In other words, this loss of the sidewalk is data-driven, but I think it's also fundamentally, counteractive to community building, even to the local economy. It's counteractive. In 1909, Fifth Avenue narrowed its streets by 15 feet, taking 7.5 feet from each side. This is from the New York Times from that time. And the sidewalk losses were a reflection of a redefinition of streets as places for motor vehicles, not for the local people who are getting around on foot on them. Now, if you think about sidewalks, though, as human beings think about them, rather than as transportation engineers thought about them, they are also, of course, places for children to play. A lot of children enjoyed riding bikes, and they primarily rode their bikes on the sidewalks, especially when the sidewalks were wide. However, under the city ordinance, it was illegal to ride your bike on the sidewalk, and the combination of police enforcement of that rule and the narrowing of the sidewalk ought to have made people realize that you're forcing children to ride their bikes in the street at the same time that you're telling people that the streets are primarily for fast driving. That is a dangerous combination. It's a combination that Harlemites warned their city about. They asked for more police protection for pedestrians and children. They asked for more signals. They asked for more police to enforce the speed limits. None of it happened, and rather predictable consequences ensued. I'll give you one example. There was an 8-year-old boy. His name is Ronnie Wiley. He lived at the corner of 158th Street and Edgecombe Avenue. This is Ronnie in the center there, as covered in the New York Amsterdam News in 1950, March the 18th, because he was riding his bike on the street because he knew that the police would harass him if he rode it on the sidewalk, and the sidewalk was too narrow anyway. And one of the most poignant things I've ever read is that the father wrote a very long letter to the New York Amsterdam News and detailing what happened here and expressing his grief. The father in this case ran a group called the Harlem Rangers. I don't know if they lasted. So this is the only evidence I have of them. But it was a kids group run by parents to help the kids have constructive things to do after school. And the New York Amsterdam News reports the fact that when kids tried to ride on the sidewalks where it was actually safe, they got harassed by the police. This says the police somehow found time to give tickets to kids riding bikes on the sidewalk, but not giving kids to the motorists who were driving too fast. So this kept going. In 1963, proposals to narrow sidewalks met with big opposition. I want to note that, incidentally, for us, the traffic engineers were going, narrowing sidewalks is 100% good. It's a no-brainer. It means cars move faster. One of the opponents of this 1963 proposal possibly is known to you all, or to some of you, George Gregory Jr., a basketball legend, also a community leader. And George Gregory Jr. was one of the people who objected. He said, what's going on here is we're seeing the interests of things being put ahead of the interests of people. And he said, streets are playgrounds. The so-called traffic experts don't seem to recognize or care that streets are also playgrounds, not just for motor vehicles to go through. This things instead of people diagnosis, I'm afraid, is what prevailed. In other words, things instead of people continued to prevail. It is behind one of the most extraordinary statements I've ever seen in an editorial. This was an engineering news record, widely read by the people who build urban highways. In 1922, realizing that mixing people and vehicles and streets is a dangerous thing to do, they said, let's redefine what streets are for. The obvious solution lies only in a radical revision of our conception of what a city street is for. Let that line soak in, because it will help you recognize that data don't drive anything. Agendas drive data. In the beginning is the agenda. In the beginning is the agenda, the data follow. This was the agenda, the data followed. How did they get the data they wanted to support that agenda? Well, they selected the kind of data that they said the experts need. And once somebody said, oh, are you talking about some kind of conspiracy theory, that they did this to sell cars? And I said, no, it's not a conspiracy theory, because in fact, the people who wrote this said, we want to do this to sell more cars. So they were quite explicit about it. And so the agenda of selling cars is driving the data, and you select the data to collect, and the data were the following. Delay. The more delay there is to drivers, the more you have to build faster highways. And diversion. The more money that drivers spend on gas taxes that isn't spent on more roads is diversion. Now check it out. If you have fast drivers going through a neighborhood, you would think that gas taxes might serve a useful purpose of, say, compensating the neighborhood with better amenities to deal with all these cars. No, the notion of diversion is every penny that goes from gas taxes ought to go right into more roads. So this cartoon, which I think is amazing, from 1971, I added the word data, by the way, reflects this notion. Actually, the data that this director of planning the car companies are interested in are the data that will sell more cars, and that means they're going to measure delay and diversion to motorists. We still have this. This is 2018. This INRIX group is saying that we lose $165 billion a year as a country thanks to drivers being slowed down. And these are the people who are telling us what kind of transportation policy we need. They want to solve everything with urban highways. This car, for example, from the point of view of this model, is delayed by narrow streets rather than causing delay, which is, of course, what it's really doing by moving one person but requiring so much space. You can see this all over the place in the era that built these things. This is a highway in St. Louis. It wrecks local neighborhoods for the sake of people who don't live in them. A lot of the people who leave them then end up using it. This was sold by the people who built the roads, namely the Caterpillar Corporation that built the bulldozers that built the roads. The asphalt builders do this too. The Portland Cement Association sell these things. These are the people who gave us the data that gave us the urban highways. These are another tire company of the present, Continental. They say that it solves congestion to solve delay. But consider the delay to the person who's trying to get to the bus stop by finding their way across this first urban freeway, the Davison Freeway in Detroit. These are what were sold. Now, this is what the vision was for New York City. You can see there was going to be a Harlem Expressway at 125th Street, one of those elevated highways. It was never built, not because of local people not wanting it, but rather because the people who built it realized they would need a bridge across the Hudson River then, and that would have meant diverting funds from the Verrazano Narrows Bridge project, which they decided they prioritized. But the Harlem Expressway would have devastated central Harlem. This is the Cross Bronx Expressway, and I show it to you so you can recognize what would have happened to Harlem if the Harlem Expressway had been built. I want to connect this to little Harlems all over America. So I'm from Virginia. In Richmond, which is about 50 miles east of me, Maggie Walker had a place called the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. Its purpose was to keep the community money in the community. The community was Jackson Ward. Jackson Ward was known locally as the Harlem of the South because it had that kind of a cultural vibrancy about it. This bank, the Penny Savings Bank building, is still there. I went to see it. I traveled to Richmond just to take a look at it. here is the view of that building today on the right. That is Interstate 64 and 95. It cuts right through Jackson Ward. It absolutely devastated Jackson Ward. Part of Jackson Ward survives and still is vibrant, but it had to survive this attack. This is Hastings Street in Detroit, the center of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, Detroit. It was too slow for the transportation experts, so their data-driven solution was, okay, this is the same view. That's the Chrysler Freeway in Detroit. Side by side, exact same perspective. Not much delay, but all those cars had to park, which is why central Detroit is basically all parking lot. You know that urban renewal was allegedly data-driven too. Of course, they had plenty of data that proved what they were doing with urban renewal, like, for example, to Oak Street in New Haven. That's Oak Street. It was an African-American neighborhood in New Haven. Remember that blank slate thing? This is the experts looking at a blank slate and deciding what they want to put there, and this is what they put there, using federal urban renewal money to help dislocate people from that neighborhood. This is St. Paul, Minnesota, the Rondo Avenue neighborhood, and that view at the top right, here's the same view a few years later, moving suburbanites, dislocating local people, and it was all data-driven as far as those experts were concerned. So this is the data-driven mobility future. The people who want this data-driven mobility future want it not so much to move people as to collect the data. You generate, according to the experts, 3,000 times more data when you're in a driverless vehicle than when you're on your phone. And for that reason, Intel is selling the autonomous vehicle future as a way to collect lots of data for free from you and me so that they can sell. And they're not hiding this. They're calling data the new oil. Well, oil is, of course, one of those resources that was at the center of colonialism. And this is a kind of data colonialism. And it's quite ubiquitous in the business world to say this. And check this out. This means that they actually want us to spend more time in cars, not less, because that means more data collection. This kind of futurism actually captures old retrograde values. I think most of you have seen the 1960s cartoon, The Jetsons, where all of the patriarchal white dominant values of the 1950s and 60s are preserved in some fanciful future. And I think you can still see that in the visions of the future mobility, beginning with these 1950s versions of future mobility, but moving right into the present. These depictions of future mobility are today's visions of future mobility, and I can't see the categorical difference between them and that Jetsons future of mobility. So to conclude, I want you to consider, what would people like Marcus Garvey say about how to not be bamboozled anymore? Or what would Abraham Verghese say about connecting to the patient as a human being rather than as a source of selective and misleading data? Or what would Stephanie St. Clair say about keeping the resources from the community in the community and turning the community into a seller of resources to others and not merely a consumer of others' resources? Same with Maggie Walker, the founder of the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank in Richmond, Virginia, which helped make the 9th Ward, Jackson Ward in Richmond, the Harlem of the South. What would George Gregory Jr. say? He was the man who said, actually, you know, streets are playgrounds too. You take sidewalks away, you hurt kids. That wasn't data as far as the experts of that time were concerned. And it's frankly still not data. The 2018 transportation experts of right now don't give a moment's thought officially to anything having to do with children needing to be able to get around safely in the environment without having to be shepherded in vehicles. And finally, what would Michael Henry Adams, the historian that I began with, have to say? Well, I want to just suggest that he might, I think he would agree that there's no place like home, and in this case, that means that if somebody's selling you something on the basis that it's data-driven and therefore you have nothing to say about it, they are trying to bamboozle you. As long as you can have your agenda on the table too, you can do business. But if you're living in a world where somebody's saying to you, our data-driven solutions are better because we have data behind them and you don't, then watch out. Thank you all very much.
Whoa! Oh my God. Wow. That's some stuff, right?